if we look at the outside world, then you will find that millions of people are very aware of myriad forms of outer suffering. First of all, there is poverty in so many countries, which means there is scarcity of food, and there is scarcity of an economic vitality, and then lack of education, and then lack of good sanitation and hygiene, and they all hang together in the story of poverty. The lack of sanitation and the lack of economic stability and disease and lack of education, everything. And so you see that, and you see that people in the affluent countries, sometimes for very genuine reasons, and sometimes for reasons about which we can be skeptical, they're taking interest in the poverty of the nations, and they're trying to do their bit to ameliorate that poverty. That's one thing. Then you can also see that wherever there is war or a warlike situation, then humanity goes through a huge amount of suffering, because there is death and there is injury, there is uprooting from your homeland, and breaking away from your family, and all the social systems break down, no education, no food, and so on. And then that's an immense wave of suffering, outer suffering, and there are various organizations which are attending to that, and the United Nations is also trying to attend to these kind of situations. Then there is, of course, the very pernicious problem of the strong oppressing the weak, and you see that this is a universal problem in human society. You find whether it's in politics or in the business world or even in the religious world or in the social world and even in the family, you find that the strong are oppressing the weak, and the weak are not given a voice, and they cannot stand up for what they think is right, and this happens to women in every culture, in every religious culture, whether it's in Hinduism or in Islam or in Christianity, that the women are the aggrieved and they're dominated and abused by men. And so this is a huge kind of suffering which is going on. For example, when the West came to the continent of North America, it meant kind of wiping out the native Indians who are inhabitants of that land, and that's a huge story of suffering in itself. And wherever there was imperialism, that's also unleashed a huge story of suffering. So there are myriad forms of outer sufferings. We are very familiar with that. And what happens is, as a result of this outer suffering is invariably kind of spills over, and it goes into the consciousness of individuals, and they also begin to suffer in their souls. They suffer in their souls because their self-dignity is robbed or is denied, and their voice is withheld, and their rights are denied, and their opportunities are not given. And therefore, the individual consciousness, for which we can use the name self for the time being, that self is writhing in pain. It's think of an animal, think of a wounded animal which has been shot by a hunter in the forest, and a deer, a samba deer or something like that, and you see that the moment it is shot and it falls down, and then it begins to writhe in pain. Now, that's an outer metaphor I'm giving, so that we understand and come to grips with the inner suffering. The self, the wounded self within the consciousness of man, is much like the writhing animal which has been shot by a hunter, and the hunter being the agent of suffering. And then the self has lost its moorings. It's simply lost its world. That's all. It's got nothing. Its world has been turned upside down, and it knows not where to begin, and it knows not where to turn to get the light and the succor. And the whole thing is what I call inner suffering. And it happens to whom? It happens to one part of consciousness called the self. A very harrowing experience. And we have to become very sensitive to that inner suffering after we have perceived all the outer forms of suffering. And let's not think that when we run to help and alleviate all forms of outer suffering, that inner suffering is also going to end along with it. Nothing of that sort. This is going to continue, and this has to be addressed separately, and this is the deeper of the two problems, the inner suffering. And that's where we need to really go in order to address and to understand the depth of the malaise.